Good evening, and welcome to St. John's in the Village's continuing lecture series on the African American history of New York City, presented by our Anti-Racism Committee. This evening, we are delighted to have with us Dr. Deidre B. Flowers. Dr. Flowers is a professor of history whose work focuses on 20th century African American women in education. Her research and writing are centered on their higher education experience and students' engagement in activism and protest at historically Black colleges and universities, as well as women's leadership of education institutions. Her work on Mildred Louise Johnson is included in the Association of Black Women Historians 2020 Black Women and the Archives essay project, and her article on Mildred Johnson was published in Journal of African American History's Fall 2020 issue. Her discussion tonight is entitled Free to Be: The African American Presence in New York City from 1900 to 1950. Please use the chat feature in YouTube to pose your questions to Dr. Flowers, and we'll get to as many as possible at the end of her presentation. And now, please welcome Dr. Deidre B. Flowers.
Good evening. During the early 20th century, African Americans migrated to northern and western states pursuing freedom and their rights under the United States Constitution for themselves and future generations. Debt peonage, limitation of employment options, and denial of equal education kept them in conditions like those endured under America's system of slavery. This period, known as the Great Migration, had two main waves. The first, before the United States entered World War I, lasted about 30 years, from 1910 to 1940. And the second, beginning the year before the United States entered World War II, lasted also 30 years, from 1940 to 1970. Between 1900 and 1950, New York City's African American population grew from an estimated 61,000 to 776,000 people. Most migrants to New York City settled in 4 of the city's 5 boroughs: Brooklyn, Queens, Manhattan, specifically Harlem, and the Bronx. Harlem emerged as the stopping ground for most migrants between 1910 and 1950. And this is where my talk will mainly focus. It was home to 70% of the city's African American population in 1910. By 1920, it was at its highest percentage. 72%. And 30 years later, only 52% of the city's African American population still called Harlem home. They began to move to the outer boroughs, spurred by employment and living opportunities generated by jobs related to World War II rearmament. Harlem lost its stronghold as its Black residents sought homes in Brooklyn, the Bronx, and Queens. During the aughts of the 20th century, New York's Black citizens were the victims of one of the city's worst race riots. The race riot of 1900 shook New York at its core and sparked a series of developments that laid the social and political foundation for the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s. The riot was symptomatic of the declining status of Black Americans throughout the nation in the last quarter of the 19th century. Racial segregation, stereotyping, and discrimination had become national norms, and lynching seemed to be a national pastime. Between 1900 and 1949, 1,791 lynchings of Black persons occurred. There were a total of 4,742 lynchings between 1882 and 1961, and 73% of those lynched were Black. With the rise of Jim Crow, Black citizens were denied access to jobs as New York City longshoremen, street cleaners, baggage handlers, hod carriers, and garment workers. Denied jobs in these unionized occupations, Black New Yorkers fought back by acting as strike breakers when unionized white workers in these crafts went on strike. Additionally, churches, restaurants, bars, landlords, and social organizations began refusing access to non-whites. Black New Yorkers filed numerous lawsuits against white-owned and operated hotels, restaurants, and theaters in response to these affronts. On August 15th, 1900, a mob of several thousand whites raced up and down 8th Avenue and the side streets between 24th and 42nd Streets, known as the Tenderloin District, assaulting and brutally beating every Black person in sight. The riot shocked Black New Yorkers into action. By the end of the decade, they had organized a local Citizens Protection League, and both the NAACP and the National Urban League had been formed. Within the first 2 years of the new decade, more than half of New York City's Black community had been born outside of New York City. The growing population of citizens required social services to alleviate problems brought on by the influx. By 1915, approximately 12 organizations had been created to address social issues. The organizations included travelers' aid societies, fraternal and benevolent organizations, day nurseries, orphanages, and industrial improvement associations. Additionally, organizations that previously only served white populations began opening their services to Black residents to address the plight of destitute Black families as their living conditions gained public attention. In the latter half of the 19th century, institutional barriers fell and Northern Black communities achieved gains as institutionalized racism seemed to diminish. Examples include an 1884 declaration by the New York City School Board that formally declared there would be no distinction made between white and Black school children. And in 1895, a New York state law was passed prohibiting discrimination in public facilities. About the same time, the school board, for the first time, appointed a Black teacher to a predominantly white school. Conversely, in the first decade of the new century, the increasing numbers of Black Southerners seemed to bring about a decline in the tolerance of the racial climate that developed in the late 19th century, which was coupled with the fear that in an urban setting, in an urban environment, unrestrained Black people would become lawless, dangerous, and violent. White citizens were averse to the influx of Black migrants, as were some Black New Yorkers, who also opposed the vanguard of Black migration because it caused deterioration in racial tolerance, as migrants clung to their regional customs and habits and did not quickly assimilate to a Northern urban lifestyle. The slow trickle of migrants grew quickly, making differences in New York's Black population very noticeable. By the early 20th century, Northern Black elites began to support and encourage migration. And by the eve of the Great Migration, Black New Yorkers began to embrace and welcome their Southern brethren. Chain migration allowed migrants to establish themselves quickly, as they frequently arrived with a name and perhaps an address of someone who could help the newcomer find a place to live and maybe provide a lead on a job. This type of connection allowed families to stabilize, maintain cultural traditions, and develop a sense of community. Scholars agreed that migration was a mixed blessing, allowing for preservation of identity, yet racial unity was elusive and a greater challenge to achieve. Few Black New Yorkers lived comfortable lives during this period. Many held unskilled jobs and lived in poverty. Their rents were often the highest in the city, and there were very few organizations to serve their needs. In Marcy Sachs's book, Before Harlem, she notes they were an impoverished and needy population that received limited support from reformers and multiple agencies. Disease often ran rampant in congested neighborhoods and contributed to the population's high mortality rates. For instance, per 1,000 deaths, 37.5 were Black citizens, while the number of white citizens was 28.5. Similarly, a 1908 tuberculosis study noted that white death rates per 100,000 were 380, while the number for Black residents was 845. Please advance the slide. New York City's Black population did not always live in Harlem. During the late 19th century and early 20th centuries, the Black population slowly streamed north in search of more hospitable environs in which to live. Prior to the Civil War, Black people in Manhattan resided on the lower tip of the island in the infamous Five Points area, often called the most depraved of the city's neighborhoods. That is the image that you see to your far left, the first image. From there, the Black population escaped to Greenwich Village. Their northward journey by mid-century pushed into the district bounded by Thompson, McDougal, Bleecker, Sullivan, and Moneta streets. That is your second picture from the left. Problems with Italian immigrants drove Black citizens further north into the Tenderloin district between 24th and 42nd Street. At the end of the 19th century, the bulk of the city's Black population settled in the San Juan Hill district between 60th and 64th Streets and 10th and 11th Avenues, now the Lincoln Center area. Northward migration made San Juan Hill one of the most congested areas in the city, and here Irish immigrants clashed with Black residents. Advance the slide, please. The late 19th and early century saw an increase in the migration of Black Southerners. Racial attitudes and stereotypes met the new migrants as they arrived in New York City. Many from the South represented the firstborn Black population, the first freeborn Black population. Their presence, because of white perceptions of social norms contributed to the rise of coon stereotypes, and white flight from Harlem created New York City's first urban ghetto and confined Blacks into a single restricted neighborhood. Migrants who followed them north arrived, branded as violent and dangerous, most headed straight for Harlem. Together, Black and white New Yorkers created the environment that affected the lives of New York's Black citizens for decades to come. In many ways, as free as African Americans were after the Civil War and the ratification of the Reconstruction Amendments, stories of their escape from Southern oppression and their northern migration seem limiting and distressing, as freedom remained elusive in many ways. Yet they persisted, migrating north for decades in hopes of building community and finding a better life for themselves. In this process, they showed their value to a country which often failed to respect them and their contributions to education, the arts, and to making America begin to live up to the promises in its founding documents. Advance slide, please. The first decade of the 20th century made way for the transformation of Harlem to a predominantly Black community. Philip A. Payton founded the Afro-American Realty Company in 1904. In founding it, Payton launched a drive to convince Black people to move to Harlem. His marketing and advertising campaign used outdoor billboards, and he was among the first businessmen to place advertisements on elevated and subway train routes. Historian Kevin McGruder's recent work, Philip Payton, the Father of Black Harlem, charts Payton's effort to locate decent housing for Black Americans. Following Payton in 1907 and 1908 were two former AARC salesmen. Advance the slide, please. John E. Nail and Henry C. Parker opened Nail and Parker Real Estate in 1910, and in 1910 were instrumental in orchestrating the sale of St. Phillips Episcopal Church's West 25th Street building. Advance the slide, please. At the time, Reverend Hutchins Chew Bishop was the rector of St. Philip's Episcopal Church, the oldest Episcopal congregation in the nation. An active supporter of migration, Reverend Bishop and parishioner John Nail negotiated a deal worth over $1 million that included the purchase of land for the rectory on West 133rd Street, a new church building on West 134th Street, and a row of apartment buildings on West 135th Street to be rented to Black households. The church and its rectory were designed by Black architects Vertner Tandy, a graduate of Tuskegee Institute and a mentor to aspiring Black architects, and George W. Foster. Advance the slide, please. As the second decade began, African-American music and musicians were emerging as the defining voices of 20th century American music. James Reese Europe organized a group of professional Black musicians into the Clef Club. The club served as a booking office for Black entertainers in the city. In 1912, Europe organized a 125-person orchestra for a concert at Carnegie Hall, featuring Black New Yorkers' most distinguished musicians. That same year, W.C. Handy moved to New York City and established the Handy Publishing Company, an African-American-owned sheet music publishing firm. Among the entertainers from the Clef Club and the Handy Publishing Company were many who became prominent during the Harlem Renaissance. Bert Williams, George Walker, Ernest Hogan, musicians William Marion Cook, Ford Dabney, W.C. Handy, Bob Cole, and John Rosamond Johnson. They were among the vanguard and pioneered the development of innovative African-American theater and music, including jazz and the blues. Advance the slide, please. Education and knowing the history of Black people was on the minds of several Black New Yorkers, most notably bibliophile Arthur Schomburg. In 1911, he founded the Negro Society for Historical Research. In retrospect, we now understand that Schomburg was building an intellectual empire for future generations to study and learn about the contributions people of African descent made to America and the world community. Schomburg, a collector of materials on Black life, sold his collection of more than 10,000 books, manuscripts, newspapers, and ephemera to the New York Public Library on May 19, 1926. His collection formed the basis of the research library that now bears his name, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, which also happens to be my favorite place. Please advance the slide. We've discussed Black America's contributions to the arts, education, and Black history. Now we turn to entrepreneurship and activism. I am quoting this person. I promoted myself into the business of manufacturing hair goods and preparations. I have built my own factory and own my own ground. These are the words of Madam C.J. Walker, a self-made entrepreneur and millionaire. Although not yet a New Yorker, Walker had a townhouse built in 1913 at 108-110 West 136th Street, 1 block from the 135th Street branch of the New York Public Library. It too, like many other buildings, was designed by Harlem architect Vertner Tandy. In the townhouse was a fully equipped beauty parlor. Once Walker moved to Harlem in 1914, she actively participated in social and political life, donating funds to the NAACP's anti-lynching campaign and visiting the White House with a group of Harlem leaders advocating for anti-lynching legislation. Please advance the slide. On the world stage, the 1910s were largely about World War I. By 1917, as Americans watched the United States draw closer to participate, Black Americans, specifically Black New Yorkers, remained divided over whether they should take up the patriotic call to join the war effort. Some chose to head to Europe to defend democracy there, assuming they would serve equally, unlike the limitations they experienced at home in the United States, where Black citizens continued to endure lynching, Jim Crow laws, and segregation. In service to their country, Black enlisted men suffered discrimination and were mainly assigned to support units. Others chose to remain at home and fight for democracy domestically. Specifically, Black Americans fought against America's racist, anti-democratic practices. When the United States entered World War I, its stated goal was to make the world safe for democracy, even though the United States denied or violated Black citizens' rights Black citizens' constitutional rights regularly. Black troops from New York's 369th Regiment, an all-Black unit nicknamed the Harlem Hellfighters, signed up for duty. Their distinguished service record abroad earned them the French government's Croix de Guerre for heroic effort on the front line. Next slide, please. In addition, James Reese Europe, who organized the Clef Club a few years earlier, also organized a regimental marching band composed solely of members of the 369th. While in Paris, the band broke the racial code between Blacks and whites. There, they introduced the French to jazz and ragtime. Yet, despite their valorous service to the war effort on behalf of the United States, upon their return to the country, the Harlem Hellfighters were denied participation in New York City's Victory Parade. Instead, they held a separate parade on Fifth Avenue, led by James Reese Europe on February 17, 1919, with none other than Bill Bojangles Robinson, the most highly paid entertainer of the first half of the century, serving as its drum major. Following on the heels of World War I, the Renaissance became the dominant intellectual literary expression of the new Negro movement. W.E.B. Du Bois, James Weldon Johnson, and Alan Locke were credited with planting the seeds of the Renaissance and nurturing it. Arturo Schomburg was deemed its bibliographer, and the 135th Street branch of the New York Public Library was one of its principal repositories and forums. Its literary talent included Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Claude McKay, Countee Cullen, and Jean Toomer. Some scholars identified the beginning of the Harlem Renaissance as a March 21st, 1924, beginning of the Harlem Renaissance as the March 21st, 1924 gathering at the Civic Club, which was initially meant to recognize the publication of Jessie Fauset's book, There Is Confusion, but became a well-advertised symposium for Black writers. The truth is that the Harlem Renaissance, or the New Negro Renaissance, whichever you prefer, began during World War I as Black artists and citizens began to raise their voices about differential treatment and the humiliation they faced based simply on the color of their skin and assumptions about their race as a whole. The first signs of the Renaissance appeared during and after World War I, when Black spokespersons for Black pride and awareness were audible and drew its formative energy from the upsurge of Black militancy in Harlem. The Renaissance encompassed many forms of the arts: literature, poetry, artwork, exhibits, music, dance, and theatrical performance. Occurring as it did during the Roaring Twenties, the New Negro Renaissance was also part of the Jazz Age and the Age of Prohibition. It reached beyond Harlem's geographic boundaries to other states, countries, and regions. Essentially, wherever Black folks were during the 1920s, their creative and resilient spirit and their talent created a renewed sense of possibilities, affirming their African-American identities and transforming their social condition. Two contributors to the Renaissance were Jessie Fauset and Augusta Savage. Fauset, a native of Philadelphia, was educated at Cornell, the University of Pennsylvania, and the Sorbonne. Hired by W.E.B. Du Bois in 1919 as the literary editor of The Crisis, the NAACP periodical, Fauset is credited with nurturing the careers of young Black writers during the New Negro Renaissance, including Countee Cullen, Claude McKay, Jean Toomer, Ella Larson, Arna Bontemps, and Langston Hughes. At its helm, Fauset promoted literary work that mirrored the social movements of the day. Her own writing offered realistic portrayals of working Black professionals, an idea often foreign to those outside the Black community. The Depression of the 1930s took its toll on Renaissance artists, silencing many of their voices. Those most affected were poets and fiction writers. Many, including Countee Cullen, Arna Bontemps, and Jessie Fauset, turned to teaching to support themselves. Advance the slide, please. As a financially struggling student at Cooper Union, Augusta Savage supported herself by doing work common to most Black women, working in a domestic capacity. To assist with meeting her tuition costs, Black patrons commissioned Savage to create busts of Marcus Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois. Savage eventually opened her own studio, the Savage Studio of Arts and Crafts, on 134th Street, and attracted students including Norman Lewis, William Artis, and Ernest Critchlow. The Community Arts Center appointed her its first director in 1937, just 2 years before completing The Harp, an artistic rendering of the Johnson brothers' Lift Every Voice and Sing, also known as the Negro National Anthem, for the 1939 World's Fair held in Queens, New York. And there, I absolutely love Lift Every Voice and Sing. This is the image, and I just love seeing those two things together. Bayard Rustin described Savage this way: "She brought a light and a fire to a room, and she preceded everyone else in terms of appreciating and participating the physical beauty of Black Americans in sculpture." Savage modestly described her goals with young artists as follows: "I have created nothing really beautiful, really lasting. But if I can inspire these youngsters to develop the talent I know they possess, then my monument will be in their work." For me, this quote symbolizes the importance of the transfer of knowledge and craft across the generations. Next slide, please. Black New Yorkers returning from World War I returned to a city soon to begin an extensive construction boom. Railroad and subway lines opened new areas of growth throughout the boroughs, and several building projects completed at the beginning and during the early years of the Great Depression transformed New York's infrastructure and skyline. Construction projects include many structures we, New York City residents, recognize today. And I'll just read a few of them, although there's several. Riverside Church, the Empire State Building, the Museum of Modern Art, the Waldorf Astoria, the Holland Tunnel, and the George Washington Bridge. As the banking and commercial capital of the world, New York was at the center of the 1929 market crash, which led to the Great Depression. By 1934, Hitler rose to power and brought with him notions of Aryan supremacy. Additionally, the Ku Klux Klan continued efforts to influence American politics and government. Despite its dwindling membership base, the Depression and the rising tide of racism, fascism, and Nazism in Europe rekindled the spirit of racism and xenophobia in America and New York for the balance of the 1930s. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, elected to the presidency of the United States, made him responsible for developing and implementing an economic recovery plan to put New York City and the nation on the road to recovery. As seen during the earlier periods of migration, New York City's Black population did not fare nearly as well as others socially or financially. By 1932, the average annual income of skilled Black workers in New York City had dropped to $1,003 from $1,995 in 1929. More than half of Harlem's families received relief payments from the city, and a quarter of all families were headed by women. The city's Home Relief Bureau paid just 8 cents per meal per family. Annual salaries for semi-skilled and unskilled workers dropped by 43%, and mortality rates at Harlem Hospital were almost twice as high as those at Bellevue. More Black women were found in the workforce compared to white women. That's 60% of Black women and 20% of white women. When LaGuardia took office as New York City's mayor in 1934, the city's debt was $1.9 billion. More than 142,000 families were on relief, and the city's budget deficit totaled $30 million. Between 1933 and 1939, the city received more than $1 billion in federal aid. By 1936, the city received a hefty share of Works Progress Administration funds. That same year, Roosevelt organized key Black leaders, referred to often as his Black cabinet, to ensure that Black Americans received a fair share of available funds. The Harlem race riots of 1935 focused local and national attention on the Black plight during the Depression and served as a catalyst for improving Black access to jobs, programs, and welfare services. Earlier in this presentation, I mentioned that New York City and its Board of Education took steps in the late 19th century to prohibit discrimination in public facilities, operate schools without distinction between Black and white children, or students rather, and hired a Black teacher to work in a white student with a white student population. Into this milieu, I introduced two Black women educators as leaders of institutions. Gertrude Ayer and Mildred Louise Johnson went beyond students' classroom needs and provided students and the community with needed resources. Advance the slide, please. Gertrude Ayer became the first Black female principal in New York City. She was appointed principal of PS 24 in February of 1935, after years of battling the New York Board of Education's examination system. This system had proven discriminatory to African-American teachers and administrators seeking advancement in the school system. In the transcripts of the Harlem Riot Commission hearings, Ayers emerged as a caring administrator who gained the trust of parents and established a suitable atmosphere in the schools and provided additional relief services for unemployed families within weeks of her arrival as principal. Advance the slide, please. Mildred Louise Johnson opened her own private school, the Modern School, in September 1934. Her initial goal was to provide herself with the second student teaching appointment she needed to complete her teacher training diploma from the Ethical Culture Fieldston School. After completion of her required training, Johnson's goal shifted and became the provision of the quality education she felt Harlem students deserved but were not receiving in its public schools. Johnson modeled her school on her ethical culture experience and used the progressive education methods she learned in its teacher training department with her students. Johnson led her school for 65 years, educating approximately 6,000 students in the small school, several of whom went on to desegregate or diversify New York City's predominantly white private schools. Its first location was in the rectory of St. Phillips Episcopal Church, and we talked about that just a little bit earlier, located on 133rd Street. It moved several times until she purchased a permanent home located at 539 West 152nd Street. So the picture just on the bottom under her image is the rectory. The building in the center is the rectory. And the picture to your far right is the final home that she purchased for the Modern School. And so we move on into our last section, the 1940s. Please advance the slide. Almost 700,000 Black Americans served the nation during World War II. Unlike World War I, Black servicemen and women were allowed to actually serve during the war versus simply being assigned to menial jobs. However, virtually all of them served in segregated units under predominantly white leadership. Continued acts of violence and denial of citizenship rights led the Pittsburgh Courier, a Black newspaper with a national and local circulation, to publish a letter to the editor on February 7th, 1942. In that letter, James G. Thompson proclaimed, "Let we colored Americans adopt the double V for a double victory." After the publication of this letter, the double V became the phrase that encapsulated the goal of Black Americans, double V meaning a double victory, Black American leaders, civil rights activists, and periodicals urged Black Americans to make their war participation a double victory, that being a victory against fascism and discrimination abroad and against segregation and discrimination at home. During World War II, jobs in the war industries of the city, especially at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, opened to Blacks. The GI Bill opened housing opportunities for Black New Yorkers in the outer boroughs. The downside of this opportunity was the dispersal of the Black middle and upper class from Harlem, leaving the former capital of the Black world a mere shadow of its former self, as the upwardly mobile took advantage of new housing opportunities by moving to Brooklyn or Queens. In doing so, they took their economic resources and social power along with them. Next slide, please. During this period, the first March on Washington movement was organized by a Black New Yorker, A. Philip Randolph. He challenged the Roosevelt administration to ensure that Black citizens gained access to jobs created by wartime production industries. Randolph was not alone in this effort. The mastermind behind the organization of the efforts was Layla Lane, a graduate of Howard University and a member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, who in her career worked as a teacher and social worker. A democratic socialist, Lane resisted believing that the fight against poverty could be narrowed to improving access to education, and that the Great Depression had proven that capitalism was programmed to self-destruct. In her view, the government needed to ensure planning of our economic life to provide jobs for all able-bodied adults. Only when this is done will there be a basic attack on the problems, not only in Harlem, but of all New York's underprivileged areas. It was her work with Randolph strategizing for 10,000 Black citizens to descend on the nation's capital, encamp, and remain there until hiring in defense industries was equalized. This strategy was based on rearmament statistics at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. The National Urban League conducted a study showing that an estimated 13,840 employees worked in 72 New York City defense plants. Only 234 of them were Black. That's roughly 3.25 Black employees per plant. President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8802, which outlawed discrimination in the defense industry on June 25th, 1941. A Fair Employment Practices Committee was established to investigate complaints and redress grievances. The FEPC and Executive Order 8802 put the domestic aspect of the Double V campaign on the national agenda, providing a vehicle for challenging racial segregation in employment. Advanced slide, please. Bessie Banks Bearden was a Black journalist and civic activist who moved to New York City in 1914. She was educated at Hartshorne Memorial and Virginia Normal and Industrial Institute, also known as Virginia State, before completing graduate work at the University of Western Pennsylvania and Columbia University. Banks married Howard Bearden in 1913, and when they moved to New York, their home was a meeting place for intellectuals and artists that included Duke Ellington and Thomas Fats Waller. Professionally, Bearden was a correspondent for New Yorker magazine and the Chicago Defender, and freelanced for other publications. She was the first woman to be elected to local school board 15 and was engaged in a variety of civic activities, including the work of the Urban League, the National Council of Negro Women. She also served on the executive board of the Harlem Community Council and the Colored Women's Democratic League. In addition, she also served as Deputy Chancellor for Internal Revenue for the state of New York and is also the mother of artist Romare Bearden. So you see, she was very civically engaged, which kept her on the pulse and other people on the pulse of what was going on in government locally and in the state. And that was her contribution to making changes in Harlem. And we've come to the last paragraph of my presentation, and I'm right about on time. While in many ways, social and economic conditions during the first half of the 20th century were challenging for Black Americans, their determination to make life better for themselves and future generations produced leaders, artists, musicians, activists, writers, entrepreneurs, real estate developers, religious leaders, educators, and many other professionals. African Americans in New York City were free to create for themselves a life that remained true to their past, yet envisioned a future far beyond their limited present. Advance slide. How are the questions going?
Hello again. So thank you very much. One question, you mentioned St. Phillips Episcopal. How did the churches respond in the early part of the 1900 or 1930s, in the riot you mentioned in the 30s? And what did communities of faith do, if anything, aside from St. Phillips, in terms of advancing African Americans in New York City at the beginning of that century?
That is a very good question. I have not studied deeply into St. Philip's participation, but I do know that they later, they had a social services agency that actually ran, I think it was out of the church, definitely affiliated with the church. And there were all sorts of services that were available to the community. I don't remember exactly what year that is. And that was part of, the research that I'm doing on Mildred Johnson. So I didn't, dive into that too deeply. But as I continue working on my research on Johnson, then I'm sure that I will dig up many more connections. One of the things I didn't say is that Bessie Banks was on the board. She was one of the first board members of Mildred Johnson School. And there are other connections too. I did not mention that John Rosamond Johnson, I have to always stop and think about that. John Rosamond Johnson is Mildred Johnson's father. So she was the niece of James Weldon Johnson as well.
Okay. Nick, I believe you had a question. You received a question as well. Waiting, give us just one moment. Yes, we have all heard about the Harlem Renaissance. How did the art being produced in Harlem cross over into the non-Black communities, if it did, in fact?
That is a good question. I am guessing at this point. I have not studied the Harlem Renaissance deeply, so this was a good opportunity to reintroduce me to it. But I do believe that there were patrons of the arts who supported the artists as they were creating, whether it was the writing or whether it was the sculpting. In the case of Augusta Savage, what I do know from the literature that exists is that the people that commissioned her for those two busts were Black Americans, but I don't imagine that everyone that commissioned artwork or that supported the arts in that period were all African American.
Got it, understood. Let's see if we have a couple of more here. For those left at home in Harlem during the First World War, how was life affected? For those that remained here in New York, as their families went abroad to fight in the war?
That is a good question. I would imagine that people were looking, this was prior to the Depression. I would imagine that people were looking to work to make sure that they could replace the income of the people that had gone off to war and to fight in the war. I don't know if everyone was trying to work. I would imagine that certainly the women were entering the workforce, probably not as much as they did in World War II, but still they were there contributing to the war effort for the country.
And in the Great Migration, did New York draw? Was it attractive to particular individuals, or did it just become open in a place that people from all over moved upwards into New York, northwards into New York?
Well, during the Great Migration, both phases, I think the first phase, 1910 to 1940, everyone was moving straight north. But with the second phase, I think you saw more people go north and west. And if I'm not mistaken, I think they traveled pretty much along the train routes that were coming out of the South. So that's how you saw people, you saw where people landed. Isabel Wilkerson's book, The Great Migration, is excellent. It is very long, it is very thick. I thought I had it out here right near me. It gives you a real look into the lives of people and how they were leaving the South and the reasons they were leaving the South. And for me, as I read the book, what I understood is that, you know, this isn't that far in the past. Migration was still continuing up until 1970. And, you know, that was just about 50 years ago, right? So people were still trying to get out of the South. And now you've seen, I actually did a paper when I was still in school about reverse migration, people going back for a different set of reasons to get out of the North and out of the cold and to be able to have a better quality of life because the cost of living was not so much there. Whereas prior, they could not get jobs to support themselves. So they were leaving and looking for work and for a better life.
Understood. Thank you. What can we learn from this period in Harlem and other Black communities in New York City as we look to anti-racist work in our city today? What do
repeat that one more time for me?
What can we learn from this period in Harlem that you've discussed and from other Black communities in New York City as we look now in the present moment to anti-racist work and to make the world a more equitable place?
I think that what we probably need to do, because I feel like we are still kind of in silos. I live in Harlem, and we have a mixed building, people of different faiths, people of different religions. I said faiths, religions, and different ethnic groups. I think that we probably need to do more of engaging with each other and talking, and then planning. I think about churches, and it doesn't seem that they're as diverse as they could be. Mm-hmm. You know, we can always pick up a public service project, that's what I'm calling it, but a social service project to do something for one day, but what are we doing on a consistent basis? We could also probably pay more attention to our elected officials and what they're doing, government, basically, what are they doing to support the growth and development of the people in their districts? What are we doing? Are we making conscious budget decisions about what we're going to fund? How are we going to address the needs of our people? Do we know what the needs are of our people? I love that piece that I found about the Urban League doing a study of the number of people that were working in war industries. How can we say we're equitable when certain people are not hired? Are we giving people opportunities? Just like in the beginning, when Black folks wouldn't be hired, in the beginning of the discussion, Black folks couldn't be hired because they were Black, because they were non-unionized. But the minute those workers went on strike, they would take them in as strike breakers. Why can't we, look at people for the talents that they have and the potential that they have to complete the work? I'm trying to remember, I think it was Layla Lane who said that education will not be the sole reason, the sole way that we get Black people engaged in work. So it's we have to look beyond that. What else are we doing? It's not just education. It's not going to not get you involved in the work, but not move you beyond the financial conditions you're in right now. It's not just education. There's much more to it. We need to look at a broader picture.
Thank you. One last question. You mentioned the riot of 1900 and one again in 1935, which is perhaps a little more unfamiliar to many listening. Could you say a little more about the riot of 1935?
I should have studied that one a little bit more, but if I'm not mistaken and confusing it, I want to say that one originated with an incident on 135th Street. And I think the crowd, the community believed that the young man that had been, I think he was lifting something from the from one of the stores on 125th Street, and they escorted him out of the back door. And with the officers taking him out of the back door, the crowd believed that he had been killed or harmed by the police officers, and that's one of the things that ignited it. I think of that particular incident more in line with some material I read about Jane Bolin, who was the first, if I'm not mistaken, the first Black woman who was appointed to a judgeship in the United States. And she was appointed by, I want to say, LaGuardia in the 1930s. And she also had some concerns about children and their quality of life as well. And I think she was appointed to the family court, if I'm not mistaken. I think that's where she was, or where she served.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And thank you, Dr. Flowers, certainly for your generosity of time and for your tremendous presentation this evening. I know we've all learned quite a bit. And thank you to each of you for tuning in tonight and joining us. And together we say good night. Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.